Okay, let's talk about Alice Bailey. This is another occult researcher or esoteric writer who has been vilified online. But what do people really know about Alice Bailey? Now, she's been characterized as a satanic Luciferian and a person that helped create the New Age. She used that term quite a bit. Now, she did create some groups such as the Lucis Trust and the Arcane Schools. And the name Lucis Trust alone is a trigger to get her called many different names. But quite honestly, I don't think people have truly studied what this woman was doing. So let's take a look at who Alice Bailey was. Okay. Now, Alice Bailey was born in 1880, and she was orphaned at a very early age. Both of her parents died from tuberculosis, and she had a sister, but she was fond of her sister, but jealous. And her sister went on to be a doctor and a researcher, and Alice went on to do missionary work. Now, Alice Bailey was born Alice Latrobe Bateman in Manchester, England. And as I said, she was orphaned at an early age. Now, she has always identified herself as a Christian. And to make the long story short, her work combined Christianity and elements of Buddhism and Hinduism. She never talked about worshiping Satan or Lucifer or any of that. And she believed she was carrying on the work of Helen Blavatsky. Now, how did she get to this point? Well, when Helen Blavatsky died, a lady named Annie Besant took over running the Theosophical Society. And Annie Besant was a British socialite and theosophist and women's rights activist and a writer as well. And she was a supporter of Irish and Indian self-rule. And she lived during the time of the expansion of the British Empire when the British were in India and in quite a bit of Ireland as well. Now, Miss Besant ended up working with a gentleman named Charles Ledbetter, who was a priest in the Church of England, and he left it and became interested in spiritualism and hooked up with Annie Besant. However, he got into a scandal where he was supervising teenage boys who asked about, I guess, sexual frustration, and he advised them basically to self-pleasure. And because of that, he was forced out of the Theosophy Society for a while, and he came back in at a later time. But they came before Alice Bailey, and they were working with Olcott for a while after Helen Blavatsky died. But Alice Bailey was coming into Theosophy eventually. But let me tell you a little bit about her life. As I said, she was orphaned early. She was suicidal. She tells you in her unfinished autobiography she tried to commit suicide 3 times. And she was a difficult child, and she was passed around to governesses. At the age of 15, she was allegedly visited by an Indian man, a strange Indian man who told her to start behaving herself because she had work to do, and he would periodically visit her throughout her life. At that point, she changed her ways and didn't know what her purpose was going to be, but she ended up finding herself into missionary work through the YMCA and ended up in Ireland and then eventually India. And at the time, the British soldiers were in India. They used to call him Tommy Atkins. It was just a general term for the soldier. And she was helping them and basically doing evangelizing in India, as well as working and taking care of these men and being there to talk to them. And she was also there to be by some of these men when they were dying. So she received a small salary based on that, but she wasn't sure where she was going to go in life, but she was a very strong Christian and felt that she was doing God's work. Now, there were some men that wanted to marry her, but she didn't want to, and she ended up falling in love with a man who really wasn't of her social status, which was an important thing back then, and his name was Walter Evans. Eventually, they were married, and they moved to America and had 3 children. Walter became an Episcopalian minister at a church in California. But his temperament turned violent and abusive throughout the marriage. And he pretty much beat her pretty badly. At one point, she was pregnant, and he threw her down the stairs and caused an early birth of their daughter and caused the child to have heart problems because of it. And his temperament just got worse and worse that they couldn't hide it anymore from the other church members, and she had to separate from him. And he pretty much financially abandoned her and the 3 children. And to support herself, she ended up having to work in a sardine factory while she hired some people to watch her children. And she did this and raised them. Now, she did it on her own because her husband just pretty much abandoned the children and her financially and physically and emotionally. And she didn't want to get a divorce right away, but eventually she did. And when her children grew up, she finally had some time to herself, and she started to read about Helen Blavatsky's secret doctrine. And she got pulled in that direction, and then she believed she was getting visitations, telepathic communication, to carry on this work. And so she got involved in the Theosophy Society in California and then met her second husband, Foster Bailey, and they got married, and they became prominent members of the Theosophical Society and moved up the ladder. And they felt that Alice was being given information to write, which she started writing these books, and it was well received. And then there was a jealousy, apparently, between what she was doing and how Annie Besant felt the society was supposed to be run. And so members that were supporting Alice were upset with members that were supporting Annie Besant. And eventually Alice and Foster Bailey were kicked out of the Theosophical Society. And so they went on to form their Lucius Trust and the Arcane Schools. And she ended up writing over 24 books, and some of it, she claims, was dictated to her by the master or masters, the Tibetan, she said, Dijwa Kul and whoever else. But she ended up writing over 24 books and spent 30 years of her life until she died in 1949 at the age of 69, writing these books, and she'd never finished her autobiography. It ends at the point of where she was at in life. So when people cut her down, they're not telling the truth that she always considered herself a Christian and felt that she was helping to bring Christ back into the world, but she was combining her belief system of Christianity with elements of Buddhism and Hinduism. And that term Lucifer, or Lucius, seemed to be a popular term for light and knowledge back in the 1800s. Now, there are some things in one of her books I find peculiar, and I'll bring that up here at the end. That kind of gives me a concern. Now, I'm not really sure if I believe she was communicating with anybody, or if it was all imagination and she was getting it from all the books that she had read from Helen Blavatsky. I don't know. I'm just going to present, what she wrote. I'll read a little bit from her unfinished biography. She always believed in, the good of people after she changed. She writes on page 2, I was an unhappy, exceedingly disagreeable little girl, a society in the gay 90s, which I didn't find so gay, and then an evangelist of the Billy Sunday type and a social worker. Again, not so gay, except that I was young and tremendously interested in everything. Later, I married Walter Evans and found myself functioning as the wife of a rector of the Protestant Episcopal Church in California and the mother of 3 girls. Okay, on page 3, she writes, I became next an occult student, a writer of books which have had a wide and constant circulation, and which have been translated into many languages. I found myself the head of an esoteric school, all unwittingly and without any planned intention, and the organizer, with Foster Bailey, of an international goodwill movement, not a peace movement, which proved so successful that we had centers in 19 countries when the war broke out in 1939. Okay, end quote. So she was living during the Second World War, and it was an incredibly frightening time. Now let me continue on page 4. She says, quote, first of all, the fact of the masters of wisdom, who work under the guidance of the Christ, I want to make clearer the nature of their work. I want to present them to the world as I personally know them, because in the years that are coming, more and more people will testify to their existence, and I would like to make the way easier for them. This I will enlarge upon later and show how I personally came to know of their existence. In everyone's life, there are certain convincing factors which make living possible. Nothing can alter one's conviction. To me, the masters are such a factor, and this knowledge has formed a stabilizing point in my life. Okay, on page 7 she says, you can see, therefore, that as a life story, mine does not matter much. As a means, however, of proving certain facts which I know to be essential to the future happiness and progress of humanity, the fact of the masters, the unfolding future for which the World War just ended, is but a preparatory stage, and the possibility of telepathic and direct spiritual contacts and knowledge, what I say may prove to be of service, end quote. Okay, so she talks a lot about, her family, and it was rough. And then she, like I said, went to India for a while and was doing the missionary work. And then she believes that, at the age of 15, she was visited. She writes, quote, on page 35, quote, it was a Sunday morning. The previous Sunday I had heard a sermon which had aroused all my aspiration. This Sunday, for some reason, I had not gone to church. All the rest of the house party had gone, and there was no one in the house but myself and the servants. I was sitting in the drawing room reading. The door opened, and in walked a tall man dressed in European clothes. Very well cut, I remember, but with a turban on his head. He came in and sat down beside me. I was so petrified at the sight of the turban that I could not make a sound or ask what he was doing there. Then he started to talk. He told me there was some work that it was planned that I could do in the world, but that it would entail my changing my disposition very considerably. I would have to give up being such an unpleasant little girl and must try and get some measure of self-control. My future usefulness to him and to the world was dependent on how I handled myself and the changes I could manage to make. He said that if I could achieve real self-control, I could then be trusted, and that I would travel all over the world and visit many countries doing your master's work all the time. Those words have rung in my ears ever since. He emphasized that it all depended upon me and what I could do and should do immediately. He added that he would be in touch with me at intervals of several years apart, end quote. And then she continues on. It's just that she was, believes she was visited again years later. So she really didn't have the greatest of life. She was trying to dedicate herself to God. She even wrote in this book, when life was really hard, she would think, what would Jesus have me do? Even after her husband, beat the crap out of her. I do want to find this one page where she describes what he did. Yeah, let's see if I can find that real quick. Okay, on page 114, she says, quote, "My youngest girl, Ellison, was due in January, and in one of his fits of temper, my husband threw me down the stairs with, it turned out, a bad effect upon the child. She was very delicate after birth, being what is colloquial called a blue baby, with a leaking heart valve, and for years it was never believed that I could raise her. But I did, and she is now quite the stronger of the three girls. After this, things went from bad to worse. Everybody knew that things were all wrong at the rectory, and everybody did what they could to be helpful," end quote. So this poor woman was just getting the crap beat out of her by her Christian minister husband, who eventually abandoned her and her three children. And I find that interesting that nobody online brings that up. And to support herself, she had to go work in a sardine factory until her children were grown. She was on her own completely. They separated, and he didn't care. So, like I said, when her children were grown, she started to get into this studying and devoted the remaining 30 years of her life to writing these books and getting things started. Now, as I said, there is one thing I find peculiar in this autobiography, and it's on page 250 under the title, "The New Group of World Servers." And it talks about a group that's going to come out through the externalization of the hierarchy. And what disturbs me is that this group's name is Legion. So I'm going to read this to you. Another phase of my work came into existence about 10 years ago when I started to write certain pamphlets for the general public, calling attention to the world situation and to the new group of world servers. I thus endeavored to anchor on earth, if I may use such a phrase, an externalization or a symbol of the work of the hierarchy. It was an effort to band together subjectively and, where possible, objectively, all those people of spiritual purpose and a deep love of humanity who were actively working in many countries, either in organization or alone. Their name is Legion. Some few are known to the workers in the Arcane School and to Foster FB, which is Foster Bailey, and AAB, Alice A. Bailey. Thousands are known to me, but not to them. All are working under the inspiration of the hierarchy and are either consciously or unconsciously fulfilling the duties of agents of the masters. Together they form a band closely knit on the inner side by spiritual intention and love, end quote. Okay, the term legion is often referred to demons in the Bible. So I think, some of these terms that she used, like Lucifer and Lucius Trust and Legion, triggers a lot of people into wondering exactly who she thought she was talking to. And those are very good questions. Now, I've read about half of her books, and for those wondering why she, is associated with this New World Order and New Age, it's because she wrote several books such as The Externalization of the Hierarchy or The Destiny of the Nations or The Reappearance of the Christ that talk about what the world is going to be like under the hierarchy's control. And if you pick up the book, she refers to, she actually uses the term New Age civilization. So she outlines quite a bit of how they're going to structure the world under this hierarchy. And so thus, we're not free. We're under this hierarchy, which are spiritual entities. Some of them have incarnated or they have people on the earth plane working for them. But, to me, that's a great concern. So I want to read a couple things here from the hierarchy, or the externalization of the hierarchy. Page 498, quote, "It lies in the hands of the United Nations to protect this related energy from misuse and to see that its power is not prostituted to selfish ends and purely material purposes. It is a saving force and has the potency of rebuilding, of rehabilitation, of reconstruction," unquote. That's where she's talking about nuclear energy. She talks about the opposition, quote, on page 499. "Signs of this opposition can already be seen in the utterances of certain powerful men who are today encouraging a gloomy outlook in London and in Washington and elsewhere. The Vatican, that wealthy and reactionary ecclesiastical organization, has already expressed its disfavor because that church knows, as do all the vested and moneyed interests, that their days are numbered, provided humanity governs its decision during the next 50 years by the idea of the greatest good to the greatest number. World decisions must therefore in the future be based upon a steady determination to further right human relations and to prevent selfish control, financial or ecclesiastical, by any group of men, anywhere in any country. We believe the determination of Great Britain, the United States, and Canada, who are in the possession of the secrets, is along these lines," end quote. Now, that's interesting, who she pointed out. Okay. She talks on page 51 about what some of the things, the hierarchy is going to do. And this is another area that she got in a lot of trouble. But let me read it, quote, "I have in the above remarks enumerated for you certain of the objections facing the hierarchy at this time and involving the personal attention of the Christ. They all have a potent and beneficial effect upon humanity. Let me enumerate them in concise form because it is essential that there be clear perception of the emerging values of the part of workers of all grades and kinds in the world. For otherwise perception is not possible. To each point enumerated, I will append in a few brief words The reason why it is regarded as important. Okay, number 1, the reorganization of the world religions. The reason, A, to make way for the world religion, universal religion. B, to return humanity to the simplicity which is in Christ. C, to rid the world of theology and ecclesiasticism. Point 2, the gradual dissolution of Orthodox Judaism. Reasons. A, because its presentation of a wrathful Jehovah, caring only for his chosen people. This is basic evil. The Lord of the world, the God in whom we live and move and have our being, is totally otherwise. B, because it is a separativeness. C, because it is so ancient that its teachings are largely obsolete. D, because when the Jews become spiritual, they will greatly benefit mankind, for they are found in every land. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute, end quote. This got her into trouble, but she wasn't talking about getting rid of Jews. She said, get rid of your stupid religion. Okay, number 3, preparation for a new revelation. Reasons. A, because where there is no vision, the people perish. B, because human expectancy indicates its emerging presence. C, because the new invocation will inevitably bring it to us. 4, the reaction of the hierarchy to Shambhala. Reasons. A, produces a direct channel. B, conditions the inflow of power energy. C, relates the will to do good to goodwill. D, creates new construction tensions and new ashrams. Okay, point 5, a closer relation of the hierarchy to humanity. Reasons. A, produces in the near future the externalization of certain ashrams. B, leads to the reappearance of the hierarchy on earth. C, recognizes that man's point of development warrants this. D, presents a nearing opportunity for revelation. Point 6, an effort to avert war. Reasons. A, because the next war would annihilate the greater part of the human race. B, because having a religious basis, the hate involved would be greater far than anything hitherto known. C, because Shambhala would be involved, and this has never been the case. End quote. So, she didn't say get rid of Christianity per se. And if you read her work, she's really combining Christianity and elements of Buddhism and Hinduism. Now, you could continue on, and, she talks about this appearance of the hierarchy. And she talks about some of them incarnating or just coming onto the earth. And if we could prepare the earth for them, it would be a quicker time for them to come. She also talks about the United Nations being the government. She talks about the creation of the triangles. These are groups of people that were going to affect the change. On page 64, she says, in this decade of my work, 2 major activities were inaugurated: the creation of the triangles and the formation of men of goodwill. And these are just on the verge of a major creative activity. End quote. So she goes on and talks about, various things that have to happen. And she even talked at one point, I recall, about destructive agents that were going to be used to start breaking down some of these old systems. So she most definitely outlined a government, a world government, and a coming religion. Now, this is interesting too. On page 568, she said, for some time, ever since 1425 AD, a date which I referred to earlier, the hierarchy has been aware that the time would come when this projected movement would take place. End quote. Well, 1425 was right around when quite a bit of the Inquisition was going on, pretty heavily. So that's interesting as well. Okay, I also want to point out, she talked about, used the term New World Order. And She writes on page 190 through 191, steps towards the New World Order. She actually, end quote, she actually uses that term. And she outlines all of these steps that they're going to do. And she says, the most interesting one to me is disarmament. Her step 9, it says, quote, in the preparatory period for the New World Order, there will be a steady and regulated disarmament. It will not be optional. No nation will be permitted to produce and organize any equipment for destructive purposes or to infringe the security of another nation. One of the first tasks of any future peace conference will be to regulate this matter and gradually see to the disarming of the nations. End quote. I mean, that's the United Nations. If I'm going to show you some pictures. I've been out there, and they have a big, I guess, sculpture of a gun tied in a knot. And there's not a good feeling about the United Nations, and I've been there twice. The first time I went was in the 1990s, and I didn't take pictures at the time, but they had a lot about water conservation. They wanted to move most of the people to the cities. They didn't want you to be spread out. They wanted you controlled like cattle. The second time I went to the United Nations several years back, they removed that, and they had just some artwork, and they basically stated that they were not part of any country. They were a separate entity on land donated to them by the Rockefellers. And the art that they had in there was just bizarre. Now, they had a picture that looked like it was an angel in front of a black pyramid. And then they had a picture with several, people that were representative of humanity. And in the middle was a Jew. And I thought that was strange because he was dressed like an Orthodox Jew, which is something strange considering that she thought that the Jewish religion had to go. So, I don't, like I said, I don't really know if she was getting this from a telepathic communication, or she was just involved in Freemasonry because her and her husband were Freemasons. It sounds very Masonic. They always talk about the brotherhood. And also here on page 24, she talks about this Wesak festival. And she wanted to make that a holiday down the road. So, it's interesting. She definitely outlines a world government that is guided by this non-human hierarchy, and talked about how, they were going to disarm everybody, and they wanted groups of intelligent world servers to work on certain issues, and the United Nations to be the world government, and on, and a new religion. So, and this is another interesting one. On page 511, she says, the Masonic movement, when it can be divorced from politics and social ends and from its present paralyzing condition of inertia, will meet the need of those who can and should wield power. It is the custodian of the law. It is the home of the mysteries and the seat of initiation. It holds in its symbolism the ritual of deity, and the way of salvation is pictorially preserved in its work. The methods of deity are demonstrated in its temples, and under the all-seeing eye, the work can go forward. It is a far more occult organization that can be realized and it is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists. In its ceremonials lies hid the wielding of the forces connected with the growth and life of the kingdoms of nature and the unfoldment of the divine aspects in man. In the comprehension of its symbolism will come the power to cooperate with the divine plan. It meets the need of those who work on the first ray of will of power. End quote. So she didn't say that they wanted to get rid of Freemasonry. In fact, she's promoting it. And we see this all Sinai everywhere. And we have major conflict of religion. She even talks about the return of the Christ. They're preparing for, the return of the Christ. On page 574, she says, in the meantime, as the first group struggles with the immediate problem in the outer world, and the second group still within the confines of the hierarchy, itself makes due interior preparation and applies to its chosen members the needed training and the desired reorientation. The Christ and the Masters are occupied with the task of preparing for the restoration of the mysteries. This restoration will fall into these three phases and will cover and include in its symbolism all phases of human unfoldment. The story of mankind will be pictorialized. These three phases correspond broadly and in general sense to the 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge in Masonry. The analogy is not entirely accurate owing to the unavoidable degeneracy of Masonry, but with the restoration of the mysteries, Masonry also will come into its own. And then she says these phases are, and she talks about the ritual of the EA and a stage of complete economic reorientation and the reward of light and initiation. So, they definitely had a plan. They, some of it's already taken place. A lot of it hasn't yet, but it tends to look more Masonic to me. This whole structure she's talking about, but that gives you a feel for it. And she thought she was going to bring Christ back, and like I said, she was, in my opinion, combining Christianity with elements of Hinduism and Buddhism and Freemasonry. The Freemasonic structure, and felt like this hierarchy was working with Christ and they were going to make the world better. So I don't really know if she kind of made all this up just because of what she was involved in, or if she was getting this from somewhere. All I could say, and then they had a big fight when she was in the Theosophical Society. Her and her husband were kicked out because they felt that they were teaching something that wasn't correct. So, you can make your own mind up about it. And, like I said, I hopefully brought something different to the tables. This woman was abused and she was an orphan. And she kind of fell into this after having to raise her children on her own, and thought, quite honestly, she thought she was doing something good for humanity. Whether or not it is remains to be seen. I don't think we should ever be disarmed. People have to be able to defend themselves. And as far as some of these religions that have to go, yeah, I agree with that. But what are you going to replace it with? And they talk about wealth redistribution. No, I don't agree with that at all. So we have to, be aware of this and decide, who is she to decide? Who is this hierarchy? When are humans free? Why are we not getting to decide our own destiny? So she raises more questions in my mind, and I don't quite trust her stuff. I do like the Helen Blavatsky work because it exposed a lot of things. The stuff that Helen Blavatsky was talking about, nobody else was, especially with this stating that the Nagas were egg layers and lived under the ground and in caves and in, temples. So I would be concerned about some of these things that Alice Bailey was promoting, and that's my conclusion. But it's interesting to me that nobody talked about her life and how she got to that point. And she did still believe she was a Christian. She was waiting for Christ, and she thought she was helping to bring him in. But I'm not so sure. Her description of things don't really sound like a good thing, if that's what they got planned for us. So that is Alice Bailey and the New Age. Thank you.